This is joint work with Pasquale Restrepo, and what we are trying to do is speak to the concerns about the effects of automation on the labor market. There's a lot of concern on this question. There is some evidence that automation process has led to polarization of jobs, with the middle disappearing, and even polarization of wages. For example, Outer Levy and Murnane's work. And there is a lot of concerns about the increase in the share of capital income in national income, and unemployment or low employment being related to the effects of technologies. And of course, we've been here before. Keynes in 1929 worried about technological unemployment. Leontiev mused that we may go the way of the horse, where while everything depended on the horse in the 19th century for transport, with the technological revolutions in the transport industry, horses became redundant. So he asked, why shouldn't it be that labor doesn't become redundant? And in fact, the current phase of automation, robotics, is quite striking. So this is a Hyundai plant, and the notable thing here is that there aren't that many workers. All of the tasks that were performed by workers in the 1970s and the 80s are now being performed by robots in such plants. And the same is true in pharmaceuticals, much less, but same sort of trend in food manufacturing and chemical and electronics, which are two major sectors, but not very good pictures from those sectors. So I'm going to look at the effects of industrial robots, which are automatically controlled, reprogrammable, and autonomous multi-purpose machines as defined by the International Federation of Robotics. That's a subset of automation technologies, but it's an important subset, and it's a distinguishable subset. And they've been spreading very rapidly. Actually, the US is a fairly notable laggard. Germany, Japan, and Korea are much ahead of the United States. In fact, why that is the topic of the new work that Pasquale and I are doing, but I'm not going to talk about that. And there are currently close to 2 million industrial robots in operation globally. And the automotive industry employs 39% of these robots. Now we're comparing a little bit apples and oranges here. Robots are different, but we don't have as good estimates of the value of robots in different sectors. So I'm going to compare their numbers, and then you can see electronics and metal products, for example, employ another chunk of it. And then, many experts are forecasting that these are coming soon. So these are the trends in robots, and you can see the U.S. lagging behind. U.S. is the triangles, and by Europe here I mean a few countries in Europe: Germany, France, Netherlands, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, and Italy. But relative to those, the U.S. is lagging behind. In all of them, you have a fairly rapid buildup of robots, but U.S. behaves a bit like the 30th percentile of the European distribution. So we'll come back to that later. Now, what do we know about the effects of automation and robots? And the answer is yes, some stuff, but not all that much, because the dominant paradigm here, also adopted by the World Bank recently, McKinsey and Frey and Osborne's paper that received a lot of publicity, is that they do feasibility studies of which tasks and which occupations can be automated. But this is not particularly useful for many of the questions that economists ask, because first of all, the fact that something is feasible to automate doesn't mean that it will be automated. It's a cost calculation. Second, of course, these feasibility studies are, fairly audacious projections into the future. But thirdly, they're not really speaking about the equilibrium impact of robots. Of course, agricultural machinery, for example, replaces agricultural workers, but then it created lots of jobs in the industrial and service industry. So you really need to look at the equilibrium impact, looking at the labor market that becomes affected by the arrival of additional robots. So to do this, we're going to start with a simple task-based framework where the unit of production are tasks, and tasks can be produced by labor, or they can be produced by machines if they have been technologically automated. In this context, I'm going to show you today that there is a very simple relationship between the effects of robots and changes in employment and wages. In particular, at the labor market level, as shown by those blue curves, change in employment and change in wages are going to be equal to a simple function of what I'm going to call exposure to robots. And those two betas are not the same, by the way. They should have been beta E and beta W. And the exposure to robots is very closely related to a Bartik type variable. And it looks at the technologically driven robot penetration in an industry times the baseline share of that industry in the local labor market we are looking at. And again, I emphasize that the first step here is to look at local labor markets, which is where I'm going to focus on in the empirical work, and then we'll talk about how to project those into the national economy. So that variable I'm going to call exposure to robots, and C here is going to be our measure of local labor market, which in the US context is well approximated by commuting zones. So we're going to have 722 commuting zones. Of course, exposure to robots can be endogenous in various dimensions, but the one is that the penetration of robots in an industry itself may be endogenous to demand, supply, institutional conditions of that industry, say, for example, unions or bad industrial relations in that industry. And it could also even be endogenous to what's going on in local labor markets that specialize in that industry. So for that, we're going to use the same strategy that Autor, Dorn, and Hansen used in their analysis of the effects of Chinese imports into the US. And we're going to look at the changes in this robot penetration by industry taking place in these other advanced economies for whose trends I showed you already. So that's the empirical strategy, and I'm going to show you the empirical results. So let me not preview them, except for saying that we're going to find fairly precise negative effects on employment and wages, and we're going to also see where they hit. And then whether these effects are really large or just moderate, I think that's a discussion we need to have, but I'll have that discussion after we see the results. There are lots of caveats, and I'll come to those also after I present the results. You know, this is a difficult problem because we're trying to estimate the equilibrium effect, so there are many potential sources of confounding variation and endogeneity, so we'll come to those in a little bit. The related literature, let me also skip that except for noting two papers, the Greats and Michaels paper, which also uses the International Federation of Robotics data on robots, but uses a different strategy of cross-country and cross-industry variation, and that their results are somewhat different from ours, but we can come back to that. And then there's a very nice paper by Lee and Kraft, which collects data on the location of robot integrators in the United States. And I'm highlighting this because we're going to use these data, but it's a really cool exercise that they did because robot producers are extremely secretive. They don't give you much information about what they're doing, but in order to be able to operate robots, you need to have them installed, you need to have them reprogrammed. You know, most companies themselves cannot reprogram them. Toyota can, but most US companies couldn't. In fact, you need to be fairly advanced in the robotics technology, and you need to also maintain them. And that requires local companies, and these integrators play that role. So the location of integrators is highly indicative of where robots are being adopted. And so we're going to see that's right, and we're going to use that variation. All right. So I'm going to briefly outline the model that we have because I think it is important to understand the conceptual structure here and why it is that robots can have a negative effect. And that's actually quite important. And in fact, if you are going to retain one idea from this paper, perhaps that's too ambitious, but if you're going to retain one idea from this presentation, I would like you to retain the idea that the things that we learn and teach, or that technological change is always increasing wages and employment, is just not true in general. And it was a feature of the sort of models that we were writing, and in particular in these task-based models, which are particularly useful when thinking about automation, robots, and new technologies. That's generally not true. So to see that, I'm going to look at a model where there are several commuting zones indexed by C, as I already done. Each one of them is going to produce a final good YC, combining the output of several industries, YCI. And to start with, I'm going to shut off trade. So commuting zones are closed economies. That's, of course, a crazy assumption, but it's good for building intuition, and I'll show you what happens when there is trade. In each commuting zone, these YCIs are combined in a CES fashion with an elasticity of substitution sigma. The key thing is, how do you produce these YCIs? And there, our assumption is that you combine tasks. You could do that in a general fashion, but for illustration purposes, I'm going to assume that you combine these tasks, denoted by XCI, in a Leontief manner. And then there's also some productivity differences. So Flint, Michigan, Detroit area commuting zone may be much more productive than Boston in producing cars. So that's the ACI. So that's the first equation that's displayed there. But the second equation that's displayed there is the key that I would like you to pay attention to. And it explains how tasks themselves are produced or performed. And it distinguishes between two sets of tasks, those that are less than MI and those that are greater than MI. Let me start in reverse order. Those that are greater than MI can only be produced by labor. Labor has some productivity gamma. LCI is labor allocated, LCIS is the labor allocated to that task in commuting zone C, industry I. But tasks smaller than MI, or some subset of tasks, but I've just reordered them in this way, are automated, which means that they can be produced either by labor, just the old way, or by capital, or by robots, in this case, RCI. So you allocate capital, and capital substitutes for these tasks. Crucially, for a task that has been automated, capital and labor are perfect substitutes. But of course, the aggregate relationship between capital and labor is far from perfect substitution, because capital cannot perform all tasks, and different tasks, different goods are combined in different manners. MI here is the crucial variable. It shows which set of tasks can be automated. So an increase in MI is an improvement in the robotics or automation technology that enables us to automate more tasks. In addition, there's a labor supply and robot supply. Epsilon is the elasticity, the inverse Frisch elasticity, and eta is the elasticity for the robot supply. We have market clearing, and let me finally introduce one more piece of notation and one simple assumption. The piece of notation is that pi c is 1 minus the cost of producing a task by robots divided by the effective cost of producing it by labor. QC from here is the price of robots. So how much you have to pay to purchase a robot. And once you purchase it, we're assuming you have zero cost of operating it. And WC is, of course, the wage. Gamma is the productivity of labor. So QC divided by WC over gamma is the relative cost. And pi c subtracts that from 1. So if pi c is equal to 1, it means that robots are dirt cheap. QC is close to 0 relative to WC. So it's a huge cost saving. If pi c is negative, it means that robots are more expensive for producing tasks than labor. And if QC is positive but close to gamma, close to 0, it means that robots are cost effective but not super productive. They're marginally more productive than labor. Now, in what follows, since I want to talk about robots being introduced, I'm going to assume pi c is positive. Again, Pasquale and I have a much more sort of general version of this framework for the theory work that we've done in the past. You don't need any of these assumptions, but it's going to simplify what I want to emphasize in the next 2 slides. All right, now we come to the 2 key theoretical points I want to make, one on this slide, one on the next slide. This one looks at the partial equilibrium relationship between change in the robotics technology, an increase in MI, and labor demand. LDC is labor demand. And it shows that labor demand depends on three terms. The first one is a negative term that captures the displacement effect. In particular, look at what that term says. It says the sum of DMI, so you're summing across industries. And what are the weights in this? The little LCIs are the share of employment in industry I in commuting zone C. So why is there a displacement effect? Well, that's the key distinction of the task-based framework, that you are going to have this displacement of workers because machines are replacing the workers. This displacement effect always reduces labor demand, and therefore always creates a force towards reduction of employment and wages. That's crucial, and that's where the big distinction comes. But of course, that's not the only effect, and there is no guarantee in this framework that employment and wages will always fall following a technological improvement of this sort. And the two other effects we'll call price productivity effect and scale productivity effect. The first one is that if there is more robots introduced in the car industry, then there's going to be more cars produced in Detroit, and that's going to reduce the price of the increase in robots usage is going to create cost savings. That's going to reduce the price of cars, and it's going to create more demand from the car industry because it's still got many tasks that have not been automated. The strength of this effect is regulated by the elasticity of substitution, sigma. The last term is the scale productivity effect. When we introduce robots, we have cost savings, therefore we become richer. If we are richer, we want to consume more of everything, and that's the D log YC. I'm calling this a partial equilibrium decomposition because D log P XCI and D log YC themselves are a function of technology. So that's the first important things to bear in mind, the displacement effect against the productivity effects.
Baba,
and
how does this move? Huh?
And the other thing I would like to emphasize, going back to this slide, is that MI is not the only type of technology here. We also have the gamma, and the gamma is a typical labor augmenting technology. So its effects are very different from MI. So that's what I want to emphasize, that the effects of task replacing technological changes like robotics are very different from those of regular factor augmenting technological change. But anyway, forging ahead, this was the partial equilibrium. Now I'm giving the full general equilibrium or local equilibrium effect. You see now that what I have done is I have expressed the price effect, the price productivity effect, and the scale productivity effect also in terms of the changes in the robotics technology. And I have now broken down the impact on labor and the employment and wages. And you see that for both of them, we have a negative term, that's the displacement effect, and a positive term that comes from the productivity effect. Now you see the elasticities eta and epsilon come in because that's going to determine how the scale effect and the productivity effects respond to the changes in technology. And you have the SICL over SCL, those are the cost shares of labor in different industries in different commuting zones. But the more important thing that I would like to emphasize here is the presence of the pi c term. So the pi c term, you see that is actually multiplying the positive effects both for labor and wages. So what does that mean? It means that the more the cost savings, in other words, the more productive robots are, the more likely they are to increase employment and increase wages. So in some sense, in contrast to some things that you sometimes hear in the popular media, which is that it is the wonderful, brilliant technologies that are a threat to employment, this framework says oftentimes it's actually the so-so technologies that are replacing labor but are not creating huge cost savings, so that these price productivity and scale effects are not being operational to a large extent. And then the final thing I would like to point out is that if we take the case in which this MI is not very high, so close to a close approximation to the state of the US economy, for example, in the early 1990s, where you don't have many robots, then you are going to have that we can approximate these terms in a very simple manner, and that approximation is given in equation 1, where we have DRI over LI weighted by the little LCIs. What's that? That's nothing other than the exposure to robots. So therefore, we have just derived the estimating equation that I had shown you in the introduction, linking change in employment and change in wages as a function of the exposure to robots from this model. Since I don't want to bore you with more theory, I'm not going to go through the model that has trade in great detail. What I'm going to tell you is that it's just a standard Armington-style model, which then says, now all these commuting zones are going to trade, and they produce different varieties of the same good. The cars produced in Detroit are different than those produced in Alabama. The elasticity of substitution is lambda, and then you work out through with balanced trade, and you come to this equation, which is the sister of the equation I had shown you before. Again, you have the displacement effect. Again, you have the price productivity effect. Again, you have the scale effect. They're slightly different because there's a competition effect also, and the scale productivity effect now comes from income in the entire economy, not the commuting zone, because of trade, but the principles are the same. And then you can put those in the general equilibrium. You get some additional terms, but the bottom line is the same, which is that either with trade or without trade, you're going to have you're going to have a similar equation, change in employment on this exposure to robots, and the only difference in the two cases of with trade and without trade is that the coefficient estimates are going to have a different interpretation in terms of the structural parameters. Okay? Just 1 second. It's going to be very quick. Okay? Good. All right. Okay, so now we're done with the empirical specification. Very briefly on the data, as I said, we're going to use 722 commuting zones, data from census and the CBP, and various data on migration, household income from the IRS. But the crucial thing is that we're going to use these industrial robots information from the IFR. And then we're going to use information from 1993 onwards from the European countries that I list over there as the source of variation in the industry level technology frontier. The exposure to robots variables are constructed as I indicated in the introduction and in the theory. Change in the robots per 1,000 workers across different dates, either for the U.S. economy or for the for these 9 countries that I have indicated. Okay, so for most of the work presentation today, I'm going to just show you the reduced form where I don't do the two-stage least squares estimation, just to show you the relationship between exogenous exposure to robots, which comes from these 9 countries, but the results are very similar with the two-stage least squares. Here is a description of the data for 19 industries, where you can see in the yellow bars the industries where you have the greatest increase in robots per 1,000 workers. Those are automotive, plastics and chemicals, metal products, electronics that I had mentioned a little bit in food and beverages. The other bars show you other confounding changes that could be going on. Chinese imports, growth of the capital stock, growth of IT, offshoring. And you can see that most of these things are fairly uncorrelated at the industry level with the robots. For example, offshoring and Chinese imports hit much more low-tech industries, such as textiles, toys, and so on. Whereas we are talking about more higher skilled industries that are being affected by automotive sector, by robots. Okay. But of course, what we care about is not the industry variation per se, but the commuting zone level variation. And here, what I'm showing you is a map of the exogenous exposure to robots measure, the one driven by European level changes in industry, interspersed with the baseline distribution of employment in the commuting zones in the United States. And next to it, I'm showing you the Chinese imports, constructed as an outer Daron and Hansen. And you see that the two variables are actually fairly weakly correlated. The correlation is only 0.05, and as soon as you put some covariates, it goes down to 0. So this is important because it highlights that exposure to robots is very different from exposure to imports. Same thing for routine jobs, the measure that Outer Levy and Murnane and Outer and Dorn have used and emphasized. Here the correlation is slightly higher, but as soon as you put covariates, again, it goes down to 0. Same thing with offshoring, and so on. And here is a picture that shows the correlation between the exposure to robots at the, so it should be the European exposure, exogenous exposure to robots, and the US exposure to robots at the industry level. And you see that the two are highly correlated. They're not perfectly correlated, but they're highly correlated. US follows the European countries, not just at the aggregate, but also at the industry level. And that's essentially the first stage relationship that's very, very strong. If you regress the European exposure to robots, say across commuting zones, on European exogenous exposure, you get this relationship. The red line is once you take the outliers, and it's very, very similar, and I'll come back to that. What the covariates here are, I'm going to come back to that once I go through our main specification. But the key thing that I would like to sort of emphasize is that, as with other Bartik-style instruments, for example, what Outer Dorn and Hansen or Bloom, Draka, and Van Reenen exploit, is that this first stage relationship that I have just shown you doesn't really tell you that there are, in fact, more robots being adopted in Detroit. It says, Detroit is, by the way, that's big circle on the right-hand side, that exposure to robots is very high. So you need one more reality check here, that there are indeed more robots being adopted in Detroit. Well, that's what we can do using these integrator data. So now what I'm showing you is the log of 1 plus the number of integrators against exposure to robots, and you see a very strong relationship. Where our measure says there should be greater exposure to robots, the theoretically motivated measure, in fact, you see more robots being introduced or more robots-related activity. And here I show you the same thing as a regression form. Whether you do a Poisson model or number of integrators doesn't make any difference. Log 1 plus is the one that works best if you want to show it visually, because otherwise there are some outliers, but in all of them you have the same relationship. Again, there are many specifications here, but I'm not going to go through them now. I'm going to go through them. Exactly the same specifications are being estimated for employment and wages, and to conserve time, I'm just going to outline what those specifications are for employment and wages, and then the same ones work in an extremely similar manner for first stage and the integrators, etc. So here is one of our two main tables. Okay, so we are estimating here the regression equations that I had shown you at the beginning. And change in employment now is being regressed on this exposure measure. And then change in wage is going to be regressed in the next table. And there are two panels. One is for census. The other one is from the county business patterns, but they work very similarly. So let me focus on census. The first column has no covariates except for census division dummies, so that you're not controlling the west to the south.
Are you still having a talk?
Yes, I'm still having a talk, baby.
For how long?
10 more minutes, okay.
Can you please wait? How does that thing work of that thing going?
I will come in 10 minutes. Play with something else. Okay. The second column.
Can you help me with something on the iPad?
In 10 minutes. In the second column, we add detailed demographics. Fraction by education group, fraction by 5-year age bins, racial and gender composition in a fairly detailed manner. It has very little effect. The third column is much more important because the places that have greater exposure to robots also have more industry by construction. So here we control for broad industry shares, in particular manufacturing, durable manufacturing, non-tradables, and construction, and has essentially no difference between second and third column. And then the fourth column is perhaps the most important one because it adds all of those plus all of the competing explanations, in particular Chinese imports in the commuting zone, Mexican imports in the commuting zone, routine jobs, offshoring, and remarkably there's very little effect. And that reflects the fact that those things are fairly orthogonal. Those regressions are all weighted because we want to talk about the national also. We don't want to put much more emphasis on smaller places. The fifth column does the unweighted regression, and it's very similar. And then the sixth and the seventh column do outlier robust regressions or take out the places that are most highly exposed, such as Detroit and so on, and it has very little effect. And here is the visual relationship. The red line you see with the standard error bands is fairly precisely estimated. The red line is the outlier robust ones, and in both cases there's a robust negative effect. This table does exactly the same specifications for wages. Now we estimate these on microdata. You get very similar results if you estimate employment on microdata also, but for continuity with previous literature, we did it at the commuting zone level. And you see exactly the same 7 specification and exactly the same sort of stability and fairly negative large effects. And this is the visual representation of the wage results. So now you could do the IV estimates, and of course, given the strength of the first stage, the IV estimates just mimic the reduced form estimates, but I'm going to use the IV estimates now for talking about quantitative. So for quantitative magnitudes, there are 2 ways of you can think about this. One is local quantitative magnitude. Ask the question of what is the effect on a commuting zone such as Defiance, Ohio, that has high exposure relative to a low exposure one, such as Portland, Oregon. So for that, we can directly use the estimates from the wage and employment equations. And the magnitudes are as follows. If you take a commuting zone that has the US average exposure to robots, and you take the aggregate change in the US robot stock, these are the numbers you're going to get. You're going to get 1/3 of a percentage point increase, so decline in employment, and a 73% lower wage growth. So these are not small numbers, but they're not huge numbers either. So, we're talking of much less than 1 percentage point decline in employment, for example. So that's why I said that these are not small numbers, especially when you take into account the size of the increase in the stock of robots. But we are not also saying that, say, all of the manufacturing decline since the 1990s is accounted for by robots. Now, what about aggregate employment? Well, if you take the no trade seriously, these would be also the aggregate numbers, but of course we cannot take the no trade seriously. When we have trade, these numbers are going to be attenuated to some degree, but by how much? So one way to do it is to use the model that I outlined, and I did not go through it, so I'm not going to go through the quantitative magnitude exercise here either. But if you do that, it turns out that the trade implied numbers are not that much smaller either. Again, 1/3 of a percentage point of employment loss, but somewhat smaller wage loss. But I think the important issue here is that we are fairly confident of our estimates and their robustness, and therefore of the local magnitudes, but we're not that confident about the national projections of these because it does require some assumptions. Okay. So now I want to
How
spend
many more minutes?
5 more minutes.
How's that? I'm about
Now I'm going to spend 5 more minutes to increase your confidence that these results mean something, and then give you a little bit more context on the results, and then I'll conclude, and then we can take some questions. The first thing is that there are no pre-existing trends. It's not that Detroit was on a different trend relative to Boston. It's not that Lawrence, Massachusetts was on a different trend relative to Greater Boston. And we do that by looking at exactly the same regression, but now with the 1970 to 1990, the previous 20-year period, as the outcome. And you can see here there is no relationship in this case for the same 7 specifications. For wages, when you don't put covariates, there is a slight negative, but it disappears as soon as you put the covariates. And here are the residual plots from our baseline specification, the one that includes all the Chinese imports and routine jobs, etc. controls. Now, instead of doing these long differences, which is the way that I presented it from the model, we could also do stack differences. So 2 periods from 1990 to 2000 and 2000 to 2007. And the results work very similarly, but the most interesting thing is the last column where we put commuting zone fixed effects. So this entirely exploits, therefore, the variation coming from the fact that some industries adopted more robots in the 90s and some other industries adopted more robots in the 2000s, and therefore places that were exposed differentially in the 90s versus 2000s is the one that should derive the results. And remarkably, you get very, very similar results. You compare the 6th column to the 4th column, for example. Sorry, 3rd column, for example. This table, which I'm not going to go through because of shortage of time, worries about whether these results are just driven by automobile manufacturing. I already took out Detroit and other auto-heavy industries, but that doesn't guarantee that auto industry is not playing an oversized role. So here we take out the auto industry, separate the exposure to robots in auto and the rest, and it works very similarly. And the two sorts of sets of industries have very similar effects. And then this is the final table that I would like to show you on terms of increasing your confidence in the results. And then I'll mention some heterogeneity effects and conclude. So this one says, well, can we really be sure that these are the effects of robots? And to do that, and to also add a little bit more color to the results, we look at other measures of declining industries and other measures of technological change. So in panel A, we construct a Bartik measure of declining industries. This has very little effect. Panel B, we use for capital intensity increases. So is it the case that robots are just capturing the effects of capital deepening in some industries? And the answer is no, because first of all, controlling for capital has no effect on the exposure to robots. That's the first column in the first row in panel B, both for wages and employment. But more importantly, and in line with my emphasis that automation of tasks has very different effects from other types of technologies, exposure to capital deepening has positive effects, not negative effects. And remarkably, the same is true in panel C when you look at computers, IT investment. So there is a little bit of a negative effect for wages, but the employment effects are zero. So IT is also very different from robots. And that's also quite intuitive because IT complements a variety of different types of workers, whereas robots are very much what we modeled in this task-based framework, replacing tasks previously performed by labor. And then let me, in 1 minute, summarize the heterogeneous effects. So we look at that by gender, education group, occupation, and industry. By gender, they're very similar for men and women, slightly larger for employment for men, and very robust in both cases. And the surprise, in some sense, comes when we look at employment by industry and occupation, which are shown diagrammatically here. So the effects are where they should be in the heavily robotized industries, as you can see in this, the third set of things, which the highly robotized at the top. But surprisingly, there is no offsetting expansion of employment. And this actually is very similar to, for example, other local studies like Mian and Sufi find. And that indicates that there is some depression sort of effect in local areas that are being hit by negative shock. The same thing for occupations. The negative effects are where you should find them: blue collar, routine manual assembly, machinists and transports. But there is no expansion for management, financier, or even professional. And if you look at the results by education group, you see that there are negative effects in employment all the way to college, and for wages all the way to some college. So these changes are really negative in terms of how they affect workers across the board. And similarly, if you look at the wage distribution effects, they hit at the 30th, 40th, 50th, 60th percentile. It's only when you go up to the top 70th, 80th, 90th percentile that you don't see negative effects. So it acts to increase the wage inequality also. So let me sort of conclude by saying that this is, of course, a first step in estimating the effects of robots. It's a very important question. I think much more needs to be done, but I think the most important thing is that we need to be open to the view that even though productivity can be increased by new technologies, the adjustment to these technologies is much harder and could be much more negative for certain types of workers than previously presumed. So now I'm going to turn on my video, and you can, I guess, turn on the unmute. And if there are any questions, I'll be very happy to talk about them and try to answer them, comment on them. Thank you.
How many more minutes?
5 more minutes. Why don't you play with the iPad for 5 more minutes, and I'm gonna.
Yeah, but you said 5, and it has been like almost. It has been 60 minutes.
Right.
It has been 60 seconds. So. It has been 2 minutes. Everything has been 3 minutes.
Hello? Hi, I can hear you now. Wonderful. Hi, Eric.
Hi, Daron. How are you? Very nice talk. Thank you. You can hear me okay?
Perfectly.
Okay. My question, I was thinking about what is it about the multi-purposeness of robots that matters? As opposed to, if you have a dedicated machine can just as well replace a worker, and if I understand the definition correctly, it only becomes a robot if it can do several things as opposed to just one thing. And so what I was worried about is that you were selecting on industries that require multi-purpose machines, which would be autos. So it's very good. The robustness check where you remove autos is very helpful. But I guess I'm wondering whether, if we're looking at automation more generally, whether we would find different results, and if so, why? Or is it just a data issue? And it's just because you happen to be able to look at robots that's what you did, and that's what you're finding, right? So.
All right. Well, let me first say that there is a lot of echo, so I could only hear every other word. But I think I got the question. But if I am going in a tangent, I apologize for that. So far as I understand is what's special about robots relative to other technologies. So let me answer that in 2 layers. One is that I don't think anything is special about them relative to other automation technologies. But most technologies that we talk about are not pure automation technologies. If you think of computers, for example, they replace some tasks while at the same time increasing the workers' productivity in other tasks. Imagine the PC, for example. PC helps us, automate some tasks that were previously done by secretaries or clerical workers. But at the same time, they increase the productivity of managers, design workers, and so on. So robots are, in some sense, somewhat different in that they are very specifically replacing tasks and are not really much complementing the productivity of other types of workers. The other difference that the framework suggests might be going on is that relative to other technologies, the cost savings from robots may be low. If you recall from the theory of emphasis, if the cost savings are low, that's exactly when you're going to have the negative employment and negative wage effects. So if robots, despite what you hear from Silicon Valley and some technology enthusiasts are not brilliant, but there are so-so, then we're in trouble. But that's an open question. It's a great question.
Can you hear me like this?
I can hear you, yes.
No, I was just wondering about the policy implications, if you have any ideas about, because the last line of your last slide talks about turbulent times, and I wonder if you have any idea about how we can try to prevent them.
So I think that's a great question.
It's not closing.
It's not closed. Okay, that's a great question, and the key is that we just don't know enough. I think there are many possible policy responses to what's going on, but the exact policy responses would depend on a variety of things, and we're very much at the beginning of the process of understanding them. So let me mention a couple. So, for instance, clearly we could, based on such results, we could ask for better redistribution, and that's a no-brainer. And the U.S. especially is very weak on that. But there are more proactive policies, such as active labor market policies, training, or educational system. But I think we are hampered in being able to answer questions on this because, despite the fact that this process has been going on for 30 years or, at least 20 years, we have not really devoted much resources in investigating them. So, for example, the next phase of the robotics technology is AI in the service industry. It's already spreading in the U.S. and also in Europe, in the financial sector, in the tax preparation, in various decision-making processes. But we have no idea whether it is numeracy skills, STEM skills, communication skills, teamwork skills, flexibility. What are the skills that are complementary to these types of technologies? And unless we know there's complementarity questions, it's very hard to say, well, we need to invest in training more in a more directed manner. We need to change the education system. So I think there is a huge amount of work to be done here in this area.
Next one.
Can I just ask you another? Oh, no, okay. In the very beginning, you had this robot intensity in the US versus Europe, and we saw that in Europe it was much higher than in the US, and you said that at some point you were going to discuss that. And then, of course, you use that for, for your robot intensity variable, but I was wondering if you have any thoughts on what could be the reason for that very huge difference.
Great question also. And again, I'm going to say a lot of this needs to be done. So we don't know, we don't have a similar study in Europe, so we don't know what the effects are. We know from casual empiricism that the manufacturing sector in Germany, for example, seems to have done better than manufacturing in the US. But is that because of this or other factors? Because they have a training system? We don't know that. It is remarkable how much behind US is relative to Germany. I didn't show you that in particular. I didn't show you Korea and Japan. Part of that, we have a new paper arguing, is because of demographics. A lot of robots adoption in Europe, Germany, and Korea, for example, is demographics driven. They are facing a more rapidly aging population, and that's why you have both the adoption of robots and the production of robots being much more advanced in these countries than in the United States. And it might well be that demographics-induced robots adoption has a different effect. I don't know, but I think questions like training system, active labor market policies, different education systems are also important in taking into account these Europe versus US contrasts, which we still need to dig into.
Thank you, Professor. Just a related question related to the previous question and answer. So there's the process of technological change is driven by R&D effort and then adoption by firms, mostly in the advanced world. And that's implicit in your answer about why Europe or Korea, they have more aging population, so they have growingly scarcer factor of production in their economies. So there's a lot of investment into adopting technologies that will replace that progressively more scarce factor of production. And so
Yes.
then the global technology frontier is driven by the incentives by the industrialized world to save in production by saving the factor of production that is becoming relatively more scarce and relatively more costly. And so then the developing world is sitting there, seeing all of these technologies dropping from the R&D efforts and adoption efforts in the advanced world, but that doesn't mean that producers, say in Mexico or Brazil or Argentina or Peru, wherever, Central America, will adopt the same technologies. And I imply that from your answer about why the US is so far behind from other industrialized countries. So have you given it a little bit of thought about how these movements in the frontier of technology and automation in the advanced world will affect the workplace in the developing world?
Thank you for the question. Again, there were parts of it that I didn't fully understand, but I think the point you're making is absolutely right. A lot of the robots adoption in Japan and in Germany is being driven by scarcity of labor, or scarcity of middle-aged labor. Actually, that's what we find. There are certain types of labor, and you see that from the pattern of robots adoption, which industries are adopting it. And the implications of scarcity-driven robotics adoption, as you say, could be very different. And I think that's one of the differences in the United States, perhaps, which is that the automobile industry is not driven by scarcity. You know, there are a lot of workers that the automobile industry could have used, but for a variety of reasons, the automobile industry decided to go to automation. And of course, if the productivity of these cost savings of these robots are sufficiently major, you're going to go to do that. And to some degree, that's what might have been going on. And I think future work has to look much more carefully about demand pull versus cost side push in terms of the sources of robotics, both in understanding the patterns and its labor market implications.